I made a video a long time ago about how most names are basically fine. I went so far as to make a shirt to that effect. Name plus time equals fine. There are very few actually great names whose greatness doesn't actually come from all the context they drag in from the actual product or piece of media they're attached to. It's possible, and it does happen, where a name is so great that it attracts attention just by the name and word form itself. But that's very rare. For the most part, most names are basically just okay. There are some things that can actually render a name unusable for a property. And let's talk about those. Let's talk about reasons why a name that might at first blush seem okay may not be the name you want to go with. And we'll look at some things that violate these rules and worked out perfectly fine. First up is acronym. What is the acronym that your name forms? If your name is only one word long, this isn't something you really need to worry about. But as you have a franchise with subtitles, you start to pick up more and more words in your name, and now acronyms start to form. If you're making the prequel to your game series Magical Age, and you want to call it Generation Alpha, well, do you actually want to make a game whose acronym is MAGA? Maybe. Maybe you do want to do that. Maybe you want to do that on purpose. But if you don't want that, if you don't want that association, then this is a name that you probably want to steer away from. Both Dragon Age and Mass Effect, because their franchise name is consonant vowel, have to be aware of the acronyms that would form with various different subtitles, because you have a high probability of forming a word. I've intentionally tried to make that happen on occasion. Dragon Age Minrathous Knights is a name I have floated a couple of times, specifically because of the acronym. It is something to be aware of, and it's something that can actually escape attention through a lot of your revisions on your name, unless you have someone who is highly sensitive to it, which I am, but not everyone is. Additionally, you want to think about the implication that your name is providing to a prospective player or purchaser, and how that implication might be different for different people. So if your name is Mass Effect Birth of Shepard, nothing really wrong with that name from a word form perspective. If I don't know anything about Mass Effect and I see Mass Effect Birth of Shepard, that's pretty cool because it implies a start. So if I am not familiar with the franchise at all, I don't know who Shepard is, it sounds like a good place to enter into the franchise. If, on the other hand, I'm super into the lore of Mass Effect, maybe this also makes sense to me because I understand how this probably implies some weird bit of genetic engineering by this thing over here or whatever. In the middle case, where I know a little bit of Mass Effect, I've played a Mass Effect here and there, I know who Shepard is, this potentially can provide an implication that may not be what you want. If Shepard doesn't actually appear in your game because Birth of Shepard refers to some sort of time travel plot or some sort of bit of genetic engineering or something to do with the Reapers, then if I have just enough information to understand this at a surface level, this kind of name could be implying something that you don't want. It could be implying that this game is a direct prequel to Mass Effect 1. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's set hundreds of years in the future. As a result, you could have people enter into your franchise, interact with your franchise in a way that triggers a negative reaction to what the game actually is. We actually saw this with one of the Star Wars sequels. Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker is exactly this kind of problem. If I don't really know anything about Star Wars, I probably heard of Luke Skywalker, so I'm like, okay, I don't really understand what's going on here. That's probably okay. But for a lot of other people, it's implying something that isn't really what the movie is. So you are setting up an expectation that then you are not delivering on. Now you might say, well, that's what we want. We're going to try to subvert that expectation. And that's a risk you can take. But when you go in with a name that is providing very strong implication about what the game or piece of media is going to be, and the game or media isn't delivering on that, you have to then think about, well, what will someone's reaction be if they have that expectation and then the game doesn't deliver on that? Are they going to think you're very clever, or are they going to be mad at you? And if they're going to be mad at you, this is the kind of name you're going to want to steer away from. You don't want to imply something that isn't true unless the way that it isn't true is going to be delightful to the player in some way. Your names can get too complicated, especially in games in long-running franchises, because your franchise name can be quite long, and then you're putting an even longer subtitle on potentially. There are a bunch of ways to deal with this. Elder Scrolls deals with this mostly by pushing Elder Scrolls into the background and focusing attention on the subtitle. And then they actually pick a fairly short subtitle. This one is something that's actually pretty survivable because one of the biggest franchises in the world, Legend of Zelda, has this exact problem and it doesn't seem to hurt them that much. By any sort of complexity metric, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is really long and really complicated, but it's basically fine. Now you can see in their word form that they're focusing your attention mostly on Zelda. Tears of the Kingdom is mostly there just to try to clarify which one you're currently interacting with. It seems like what Nintendo's actually going for is they want you to be saying, did you play the most recent Zelda? Not, did you play Tears of the Kingdom? What happens when you get incredibly complicated or incredibly long titles is your players are going to find some kind of short form way to talk about your game. Tears of the Kingdom is kind of still too long to talk about the game. There's no really obvious acronym for Tears of the Kingdom. You end up defaulting back to Zelda or the most recent Zelda. And I suspect that Nintendo may be doing this on purpose. They may be trying to focus the discourse back on Zelda. Zelda is the brand. Zelda is what they want people talking about. Even though they run the risk of a little bit of confusion, I think they would rather people talk about Zelda than people talk about Tears of the Kingdom. So they've picked something long and kind of complicated in order to guide the conversation back. I bring this one up because with any of these warning signs with your name, you can probably find examples of successful games that violate these rules. Certainly, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, very long, very complicated, not a problem for them. Is your name ownable, or is it too generic? If you name your game Revolution, that's the subtitle of a lot of different games, or some form of something is the subtitle of a lot of different games. Are you going to be able to stick out? Are you going to be able to draw attention to your game with something that is that generic? As a subtitle, it's not terrible because you have your franchise name to lean into. So Call of Duty Revolution is probably better than Revolution on its own, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, BioWare definitely violated this with a name like Anthem. Anthem is not an ownable word, but it's not used by a lot of games. So Anthem has the problem if you type it into Google, you're going to not find Anthem the video game by default. You're going to find songs about countries instead of a video game, which is problematic. You aren't getting confused with a bunch of other video games, which is the problem with something like Revolution, where you're going to get mixed in and confused with a lot of games with similar titles. But it does still have the problem of it's not an ownable word because it's a word that has an inherent meaning. It's a real word. So when you type it into Google, you're going to get that definition by default, unless you are so big that you can rise above that. Elder Scrolls deals with this in a very good way, to my mind, which is all of their names, except for one, are portmanteaus. Daggerfall, Skyrim, Morrowind. The one that is the exception is Oblivion, which I would argue is the one that is the most generic sounding, the least ownable of their title names. But with Elder Scrolls, you can also imagine them even following that portmanteau running into problems. If they were to call Elder Scrolls 9 Dragon Age, well, that's a bit of an issue because you are running into another existing franchise. And even if you make it a portmanteau, so it's not actually the same as Dragon Age, which is 2 words, you are still going to run into the issue of it being hard to own that space, hard to control your messaging, because when you go onto the Google and you search for Dragon Age as a single word, are you going to find Elder Scrolls 9 or are you going to find the fantasy RPG series by BioWare? You can get this even with franchises and studios themselves. When you ask an average gamer And this is something that has been done in the past. If you ask an average gamer to name a game that BioWare made, one that shows up quite frequently in the top 5 is BioShock, which BioWare did not make. But BioShock and BioWare sound quite similar to each other, so you end up just associating those two names with each other, even though the franchise and the studio have nothing to do with each other. Is your name simply confusing? This one's a bit of a soapbox for me, but personally, with the Final Fantasy VII remakes, I got really confused with their subtitling because I don't know how I'm supposed to differentiate between Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It took me a really long time to figure out which order those go in. When you are titling something, you don't want people to accidentally buy the wrong game or be confused as to which one they have played and which ones they haven't. I would argue that a classic example of this is the Fast and the Furious series, where every single one of their movies has a wildly different title form than the others. It works for them. They're leaning into that confusion, the memeability of their ridiculous titles, but it is a disadvantage to confuse your potential players. And then finally, is your title off tone? This is kind of like Implication, a very specific version of Implication. So if you are making a Call of Duty game and you call it Call of Duty Operation Balloon Animal, you're implying something that likely you don't mean to. You're implying something with a much lighter tone than your Call of Duty game probably has. You can do this in both directions. If you are doing an Animal Crossing and you call it Animal Crossing Retribution, that again is implying something tonally that is probably not what you want. As I said up front, you can probably find successful games that violate each of these rules that I just talked about, but they are worth keeping in mind as you are looking for a name for your game. I still largely believe that name plus time equals fine, and questing for a perfect name is probably going to stop you from getting a good enough name. And you might, by over-focusing on some of these attributes, potentially actually make a worse name because you're trying to get a very specific criteria out of your naming process. Keep them in mind and monitor your names. As your game gets further along, consider testing the game and the name together, because sometimes what you might find is a name you were really happy with 2 years ago no longer really fits as the game has changed underneath it. And you might end up with something where the implication of your name is now resulting in expectations that don't match with what the game is. But name plus time equals fine most of the time. You can get it there, pick something, you'll get used to it, it's probably fine. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon now if you're more comfortable supporting the channel that way. We have merch. Of course, you could buy the name plus time equals fine shirt. This is the high T on the high C shirt. If you're interested in picking either of those shirts up or something else, there will be a tag in this video linking to the store. That also helps the channel out. What are some names of games that you played where you couldn't believe the game was called that? What are some names that violate the rules I just gave you that get away with it? Let's talk about it down in the comments. I'll see you again soon. Thank you.